Okay, we talked about slopes. Now what I want to do is take that idea of a slope and take it a little bit further and talk about how to identify if two lines are parallel, perpendicular, or neither using the slopes of the two lines. Now the one thing we want to keep in mind is when we're talking about slopes is that parallel lines have the same slope. So if two lines are parallel, they will have the exact same slope. You want to keep that in mind when we're working on these problems. Now, when we're talking about perpendicular lines, these lines have negative reciprocal slopes. Now, when I say negative reciprocal, what exactly do I mean? Basically, the idea is if you take the slope of the two lines, and we'll call that slope 1, m1 for the first line and m2 for the second line. And if you multiply the two slopes, the product of the two slopes should be negative 1. The other way to look at it is, let's say the slope of the first line is a over b, and a and b are just some real numbers, and the slope of the second line is negative b over a. That's your negative reciprocal. Reciprocal, of course, means the opposite. So if you have a over b as the slope of the first line, then b over a is the slope of the second line. And by negative, we mean one slope is positive and the other slope is negative. Now, if you take the product of these two slopes, as you can see here, a over b times negative b over a, multiply the two slopes together and your answer is negative 1. So that right there tells you that these two lines are perpendicular. So that's what you want to keep in mind when you're trying to determine if two lines are parallel or perpendicular or neither. Now, let's look at an example and try to determine if the two lines are perpendicular or neither of those two. So our example here is we have one line that passes through the points 4, 6 and negative 8, 7, and we have another line that passes through the points negative 5, 5 and 7, 4. So the first thing we have to do here is find the slope of each of the two lines. So let's call this as line 1 will have slope 1. And again, remember your slope formula is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So using these points 4, 6 and negative 8, 7, we will go ahead and find our slope. And that will give you 1 over negative 12. So we have 7 minus 6 over negative 8 minus 4. So the slope of our first line is negative 1 over 12. And now let's go ahead and find the slope of our second line. And again, we'll use the slope formula here. And we'll use the points negative 5, 5 and 7, 4 to find our slope. So you have 5 minus 4 over negative 5 minus 7, which will give you 1 over negative 12. So again, the slope of the second line is negative 1/12. And as you can see, that both our slopes here are the exact same, and that tells me that the two lines are parallel. So since the slopes are same, we can conclude the lines are parallel, and that's all we are trying to determine in this example. Okay? Now, let's look at another example here. And this one is we have the line 2x plus 5y equals negative 7, and we have another line 5x minus 2y equals 1. So instead of giving us points this time, we are looking at two equations, and using these two equations of the lines, we want to determine if they are parallel, perpendicular, or neither. So again, the first thing we will do is solve each of these equations for y and find out what the slope of each of the lines are. So let's start with 2x plus 5y equals negative 7, and try and see what the slope of this line is. So you start by moving your 2x over to the other side. You have 5y equals negative 2x minus 7. Divide everything by 5 to get y by itself, and you end up with y equals negative 2/5 x minus 7/5. And now from this you can see that your slope for this line, and again we'll call it m1, is negative 2/5. You'll do the exact same thing for the second line. Your equation is 5x minus 2y equals 1. Go ahead and solve this equation for y and find the slope of this line. And again, we start by moving the 5x over. You're left with negative 2y equals negative 5x plus 1. Divide everything by negative 2. Now you have two negatives here, that becomes a positive, and you end up with 5/2x. Positive and negative will give you a negative 1/2. So y equals 5/2 x minus 1/2. And from this you can see that the slope of this line, and we'll call that m2, is 5/2. Now of course you can see that the two slopes are not the same, but if you notice that the slope of the first line is the negative reciprocal of the second line. And again, to verify that, remember I said take the product of the two slopes. So multiply the two slopes together. And you will see that you end up with -1 as your answer. And that right there tells you that the two lines are perpendicular. Okay, so that's your second example for how to determine if the two lines are parallel or perpendicular.